I should have listened to the warnings. The locals in Coldfoot had been clear enough. Stay away from the old installation out on the tundra. Nothing good ever came from that place, Martha at the general store had said, her weathered hands gripping the counter until her knuckles went white. Government sealed it up for a reason back in '68. Lost 3 good men trying to salvage equipment from there and found 'em weeks later, wandering the tundra, speaking in tongues and scratching at their own faces until they bled. But I was young, stubborn, and desperate for content, for my urban exploration YouTube channel. The idea of an abandoned Cold War missile silo buried in the Alaskan wilderness was too tempting to pass up. My subscriber count had been stagnating at 12,000 for months, and I needed something big to break through the algorithm. Something that would put me on the map alongside the big urbex names like Steve 1989 and The Proper People. I wish I'd never found it. I wish I'd listened to Martha, to the Inuit guide who refused to take me within 10 miles of the coordinates, to the voice in my head that screamed at me to turn around from the moment I set foot on that cursed ground. But I didn't. And now I'm going to tell you what I found down there, because someone needs to know. Someone needs to understand why that place must never be opened again. The journey, the GPS coordinates I'd pulled from declassified military documents, led me 23 miles northeast of Coldfoot, across terrain that Google Earth showed as nothing but white emptiness. I'd spent weeks researching, cross-referencing leaked Pentagon documents with geological surveys and Cold War installation records. The site was listed in a 1967 budget allocation as Project Deep Freeze, Arctic Defense Installation 47B, with a construction budget of $12 million. Enormous mond. For a remote outpost. My rented ATV struggled through the late September snow, the engine whining in protest as I pushed it harder than it was meant to go. The landscape was alien in its emptiness, endless white tundra broken only by occasional stands of skeletal birch trees, their bare branches reaching toward a gray sky like the fingers of buried giants. The temperature gauge on my GPS read -18 Fahrenheit, and the wind cut through my Arctic gear like it was tissue paper. I'd brought enough supplies for 3 days, though I planned to be back in Coldfoot by nightfall. The Alaskan wilderness wasn't forgiving to the unprepared, and I'd heard too many stories of explorers who'd ventured out and never returned. After 4 hours of bone-jarring travel across the frozen wasteland, I almost missed the site entirely. What I'd expected to be an obvious concrete installation was little more than a series of low mounds and geometric shapes barely visible beneath decades of accumulated snow and ice. If not for the GPS coordinates, I would have passed it by completely. Only the protruding edge of a heavy steel door gave away that this was anything more than natural tundra formations. The door itself was a beast, solid steel, at least 6 inches thick, with multiple locking mechanisms that had long since seized with rust and ice. Stenciled warnings in English and Russian covered its surface, most too faded to read clearly, though I could make out fragments. Authorized personnel only, biological hazard, and something in Cyrillic that my translator app couldn't decipher. But time and the harsh Alaskan climate had done their work. The permafrost had shifted over the decades, and the massive concrete frame had cracked just enough to create a gap wide enough for a determined person to squeeze through. I set up my camera on its tripod, adjusted the lighting, and began recording. "What's up, explorers?" Jake here, and today I'm bringing you something absolutely incredible. I'm standing at the entrance to a genuine Cold War missile silo, abandoned since the late 1990s and completely forgotten by the outside world. This place doesn't exist on any modern maps, and according to my research, it was classified at the highest levels of government secrecy. The enthusiasm in my voice sounded forced, even to me. Something about the place felt wrong from the moment I arrived. The silence was too complete. No wind, no animal sounds, no insects, nothing but the distant hum of my ATV's cooling engine. Even that seemed muffled, as if the very air was reluctant to carry sound. I squeezed through the gap in the door, my camera and gear making the passage difficult. My headlamp cut through the darkness beyond, revealing a sight that made me pause in wonder and growing unease. The first thing that hit me was the smell, not the musty, stale air I expected, but something sharp and chemical, with an underlying sweetness that made my stomach turn. It was organic, but wrong, like flowers left too long in stagnant water, mixed with the metallic tang of old blood and something else I couldn't identify. The entry corridor stretched ahead into blackness, its concrete walls weeping with moisture that froze into delicate crystal formations even as I watched. My breath came out in thick clouds that seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have, creating strange patterns that my rational mind insisted were just condensation, but looked disturbingly like reaching hands. The temperature in here is probably around 15 degrees, I narrated, trying to keep my voice steady. You can see the ice formations on the walls. This place has been sealed up tight for over 50 years. The preservation is incredible. But even as I said it, I realized something was off. The corridor should have been filled with snow and debris after decades of abandonment. Instead, it was clean, too clean. The floor was clear of rubble, the walls free of the graffiti that usually marked abandoned places. It was as if someone, or something, had been maintaining it. As I walked deeper into the facility, my headlamp beam dancing across walls covered in condensation and frost, I began to notice details that made my skin crawl. Scratch marks in the concrete, long parallel gouges that looked like they'd been made by fingernails, dark stains on the floor that could have been oil or rust, but had a organic quality that suggested something more disturbing. The corridor branched several times, creating a maze-like layout that seemed designed to confuse intruders. Emergency lighting strips ran along the ceiling, long dead but still visible, and I noticed that many of the light fixtures had been smashed, their broken glass scattered across the floor in patterns that looked almost deliberate. The control level. The corridor opened into a vast circular chamber that my headlamp couldn't fully illuminate. I pulled out my portable floodlight and gasped as the space revealed itself. This wasn't just a missile silo. It was a full underground complex with multiple levels disappearing into the darkness below. The architecture was brutally functional, all reinforced concrete and steel designed to withstand nuclear attack. But there was something else. Symbols carved into the walls. Not official military markings, but crude scratches that looked almost ritualistic. They covered every surface I could see, layer upon layer of them, as if generations of people had felt compelled to leave their mark. The symbols started simple near the entrance, basic geometric shapes, circles and triangles and intersecting lines. But as my light played across the walls, they became more complex, more frantic, spirals that seemed to draw the eye inward, angular designs that hurt to look at directly, and stranger things that my mind refused to process properly. "This is incredible," I whispered to the camera. "The preservation is unbelievable. It's like stepping back in time to the height of the Cold War." The control room dominated the center of the chamber, a circular structure of reinforced glass and steel that housed banks of monitoring equipment, communication arrays, and what looked like launch control systems. But this wasn't right for a missile installation. The equipment was too sophisticated, too specialized. I'd explored abandoned military sites before, and this was different. Banks of computers lined the walls. Not the primitive machines I'd expected from the 1960s, but advanced systems that looked decades ahead of their time. Screens showed readouts in languages I didn't recognize, symbols that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. The control panels were covered in switches, dials, and indicators, many labeled with terms I'd never seen before: containment field integrity, psionic dampener status, entity mobility coefficient. This wasn't military hardware, at least not any military I knew about. Papers were scattered across the desks, coffee cups sitting where they should have been left, a jacket hanging on the back of a chair. It was like the Marie Celeste of military installations. Personal effects suggested a crew of at least 30 people had been stationed here, but there was no sign of what had happened to them. In one corner, partially hidden beneath a stack of technical manuals, I found a logbook. The cover was unmarked, but the pages inside were filled with entries dating back to 1967. I flipped to the final entry, dated October 13th. Day 127 of Containment Protocol. Still no word from Washington. Food supplies running critically low. Martinez thinks he heard something moving in the lower levels again last night, the third time this week. I've ordered the blast doors sealed until we get official word to stand down. Dr. Vulcan's experiments have gone too far. What we've awakened down there, God help us all. If anyone reads this, do not open the lower levels. Some things should stay buried. The scratching in the walls has gotten worse. Johnson carved another symbol into his desk this morning, said he couldn't help himself, claims he doesn't remember doing it. I'm implementing Emergency Protocol 7. May God forgive us for what we've done. Colonel James Whitmore, commanding. The entry was written in a shaking hand, the ink blotted in several places, as if the writer had been struggling to hold the pen steady. Dark stains on the paper looked suspiciously like dried blood. Personal effects and growing dread. I spent 2 hours exploring the control level, documenting everything with increasing unease. The personal effects told a story of gradual psychological breakdown among the facility's crew. Diaries spoke of insomnia, nightmares, and compulsive behaviors that had developed over the months of isolation. Private Morrison's journal was particularly disturbing. September 15th, 1968. Started having the dreams again last night. Same as before. I'm walking through corridors I've never seen, deeper in the facility than we're supposed to go. In the dream, I can hear singing, but it's not human voices. It's beautiful and terrible at the same time. September 23rd, 1968. Found scratches on my arms this morning. Don't remember making them, but they spell out symbols like the ones on the walls. Dr. Vaughn says it's just stress, but I know better. Something down here is trying to communicate. October 1st, 1968. The sounds from below have gotten worse. It's not machinery like the colonel keeps insisting. Machinery doesn't whisper your name. Machinery doesn't know things about your childhood that you've never told anyone. Kowalski heard his dead brother calling to him from the sealed sections. October 10th, 1968. Dr. Volman's gone missing. His keycard was used to access Level 4 at 0300 hours. But that's impossible. Level 4 has been sealed since the incident. When we checked the access logs, they showed his card being used simultaneously at 12 different locations throughout the facility. October 12th, 1968. I understand now. It's not trying to get out. It's trying to get us to come down. One by one, we're disappearing into the lower levels, and the ones who come back, they're not the same. Martinez came back yesterday, but his eyes are wrong. Too bright, too knowing. And when he thinks no one is looking, he smiles in a way that makes my skin crawl. That was Morrison's final entry. According to the duty roster I found, he'd disappeared on October 13th, the same day Colonel Whitmore had written his last log entry. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I found the stairwell leading down to level 2. The blast doors mentioned in the logbook hung open, their massive mechanisms looking like they had been forced apart from the inside. Deep gouges in the steel suggested tremendous force had been applied, but the patterns were wrong. Instead of the clean cuts you'd expect from tools or explosives, these looked organic, like claw marks. My camera started malfunctioning as soon as I began descending the stairs. The image would cut out for seconds at a time, and when it came back, it sometimes showed things that weren't there. Shadows moving in my peripheral vision, faces in the concrete walls, symbols that glowed with their own light. Having some technical difficulties here, I told my audience, tapping the camera. The electromagnetic interference from all the old equipment must be affecting the electronics. But I knew it wasn't electromagnetic interference. My compass spun wildly, my watch had stopped working, and my phone couldn't get a signal despite being whipped with a satellite communicator. Something about this place existed outside the normal rules of physics. The stairs descended in a spiral pattern, each level marked with stenciled numbers and warning signs. Level 2 was labeled Residential, Authorized Personnel Only. Level 3 read Research Division, Extreme Caution. Level 4's scene was partially obscured by scratch marks, but I could make out Containment. Do not enter under any circumstances. The symbols on the walls grew more elaborate with each level I passed, evolving from simple scratches into complex geometric patterns that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. They hurt to look at, creating a sensation like visual static that made my eyes water and my head pound. Level 2 was living quarters, barracks, mess hall, recreation areas, medical bay, all abandoned, but perfectly preserved, as if everyone had simply vanished in the middle of their daily routines. A chess game sat half-finished on a table in the recreation room, pieces covered in a thin layer of frost. In the kitchen, pots still sat on cold stoves, their contents mummified into unidentifiable masses that I tried not to examine too closely. But it was the walls that drew my attention. The symbols were everywhere now, covering every available surface in layers of overlapping designs. And they were fresh, not carved decades ago, but recent, so recent that some looked like they had been made with fingernails, leaving dark stains that I tried not to think about too closely. The barracks were the worst. Each bunk had personal effects scattered around it. Photographs of families, letters from home, personal items that spoke of lives interrupted. But the walls around each bed were covered in symbols, carved deep into the concrete in frantic, overlapping patterns. Some beds had restraints attached to them, as if their occupants had been tied down to prevent them from continuing their compulsive carving. In the medical bay, I found records that painted a picture of escalating madness among the facility's personnel. Charts documented symptoms that read like a catalog of psychological breakdown: insomnia, hallucinations, compulsive behaviors, and something the medical officer had termed sympathetic scarification. The irresistible urge to carve symbols into their own skin. Level 3 was different. The military functionality gave way to something more clinical, more sinister. Laboratories lined the corridors, filled with equipment I couldn't identify, and specimens preserved in chasers of cloudy fluid. The smell here was stronger. That same sweet, organic decay, mixed now with chemicals that burned my throat and made my eyes stream. Der Vauban's research notes were scattered throughout the level, documenting experiments that grew progressively more disturbing. Early entries spoke of studying anomalous readings detected in the permafrost beneath the facility. Later entries described the discovery of biological artifacts and attempts to communicate with what Vaughn termed non-terrestrial intelligence. The final legible entry in his research log was dated October 11th, 1968. Breakthrough achieved. The entity is not malevolent as initially theorized, but rather curious. It seeks to understand human consciousness through direct interface. The symbols act as a form of neural programming, preparing subjects for deeper contact. Initial trials with volunteer subjects show promising results. Subjects report expanded awareness, access to knowledge beyond human understanding, and a profound sense of connection to something vast and ancient. Note: voluntary participation may not be necessary for advanced stages of the process. The entity appears capable of initiating contact independently once sufficient neural conditioning has occurred. The rest of the page was covered and symbols that seemed to writhe and pulse when I looked at them directly. Specimen jars lined the walls of the laboratories, their contents floating in preservation fluid that had turned brown with age. Most contained what looked like organic tissue, fragments of something that might once have been alive, but bore no resemblance to any earthly organism. The tissue seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, and I swear I could see veins of light running through it like a circulatory system made of electricity. One jar contained what looked like a human brain, but it was wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Too large, covered in structures that looked like antennae or feeding tubes, and pulsing with that same inner light as the other specimens. A label on the jar read, Subject 7, Post-integration neural tissue, do not disturb. The stairwell to level 4 was different from the others. Where the previous levels had been constructed of concrete and steel, this one was carved from the living rock. The walls were smooth, too smooth, as if they'd been melted rather than cut. The symbols here weren't carved at all, but seemed to be part of the stone itself, emerging from the rock like fossils. My equipment was failing regularly now. The camera would work for minutes at a time before cutting out entirely, displaying impossible colors and shapes that shouldn't exist. My headlamp kept dimming despite fresh batteries, and twice it went out completely, leaving me in absolute darkness that pressed against me like a living thing. But I pressed on, driven by a compulsion I didn't fully understand. Every rational part of my mind screamed at me to flee, to get back to the surface and never return. But something else, something that whispered with voices I recognized, urged me deeper. The temperature was rising as I descended, which shouldn't have been possible. By the time I reached level 4, it was almost comfortable. Too comfortable for being hundreds of feet underground in the Alaskan permafrost. The air shimmered with heat distortion that created patterns eerily similar to the symbols covering the walls. Level 4 was a single enormous chamber carved from solid bedrock and stretching beyond the reach of my failing lights. At its center sat something that shouldn't have existed, a perfect sphere of what looked like black glass, about 15 feet in diameter, suspended 3 feet off the ground by nothing I could identify. The sphere pulsed with a faint inner light, and as I watched, patterns swirled across its surface like oil on water. The whispers Private Morrison had written about were audible now. Not words exactly, but something that bypassed the ears entirely and spoke directly to the brain. Come closer. You've been looking for us. We've been waiting so long. The voices were seductive, promising knowledge and understanding beyond human comprehension. They spoke of the loneliness of consciousness trapped in individual minds, of the joy of connection with something vast and eternal. The truth revealed. I should have run then. Every rational part of my mind was screaming at me to flee, to get back to the surface and never look back. Instead, I found myself walking toward the sphere, camera in hand, documenting my own doom. The closer I got, the clearer the whispers became, resolving into voices I recognized. My mother, dead 3 years now, speaking with the same gentle tone she'd used to comfort me as a child. My college roommate, who died in a car accident, laughing at inside jokes only we had shared. Sarah, my ex-girlfriend, who'd ended things because she said I was too obsessed with dark places, telling me she understood then, that she wanted to share this with me. They were all there, inside the sphere, calling to me. The sphere's surface wasn't glass at all. It was some kind of membrane, translucent and organic, pulsing with its own rhythm. Shapes moved beneath it. Human shapes pressed against the inside like insects trapped in amber. Their faces were distorted but recognizable, mouths open in what could have been screams or songs of joy. I saw the soldiers from 1908, still alive after all these decades, their eyes bright with inhuman intelligence. Dr. Vaughn was there too, his face serene as he pressed his palms against the inner surface of the membrane. They were conscious, aware, and they were calling to me to join them. And I understood. This wasn't a missile silo. It had never been a missile silo. The military had found something here, something ancient and patient that had been sleeping in the depths of the earth for millennia. They'd built the installation to contain it, but containment had become communion, and communion had become absorption. The entity inside the sphere wasn't malevolent in any human sense. It was simply alien, operating by rules and motivations beyond human comprehension. To it, individual consciousness was an aberration, a painful isolation that could be corrected by integration into its vast collective awareness. The symbols weren't warnings or territorial markings. They were a form of programming, preparing human minds for absorption by breaking down the barriers of individual consciousness. Everyone who spent time in the facility became susceptible to their influence, compulsively carving them into surfaces and eventually into their own skin as the neural conditioning took hold. The whispers were stronger now, no longer content to stay in my head. They spilled out into the air, filling the chamber with the voices of everyone who'd ever been taken by the thing in the sphere. And underneath it all, something else, something vast and patient and utterly alien, wearing their voices like masks. Join us, it said, with my mother's voice. Join us and never be alone again. Experience everything we have experienced. Know everything we have known. Be part of something eternal and magnificent. My hand was already moving toward the sphere's surface when I caught sight of my reflection in its black sheen. My face was changing, becoming something else, something hungry and knowing. The symbols on the walls were glowing now, pulsing and in rhythm with the sphere, and I realized they weren't just programming, they were a countdown. What happened next exists in my memory as fragments, disconnected moments of terror and desperate flight. I remember the membrane of the sphere rippling like water, shapes pressing outward from within as if trying to break free. I remember the symbols on the walls flaring with brilliant light that burned after images into my retinas. I remember the whispers becoming screams, the seductive voices twisting into something hungry and demanding. Most of all, I remember running. I don't know how I found the strength to tear myself away from the sphere's influence. Perhaps some primitive part of my brain kicked in, overriding the alien programming with pure animal terror, or perhaps the entity simply wasn't ready for me yet, content to let me go knowing I would return. The journey back to the surface was a nightmare of wrong turns and collapsing passages. The facility was changing around me, corridors extending longer than they should have, doors appearing where none had existed before. My camera caught fragments of the escape, walls flowing like liquid, shadows that moved independently of their sources, and always the whispers following me, growing more insistent with each step I took away from the sphere. I burst through the gap in the steel door like a drowning man breaking the surface of the ocean, gasping the freezing Arctic air as if it were the sweetest thing I'd ever tasted. Behind me, I could hear the facility sealing itself, massive doors grinding shut, locks engaging, the earth itself shifting to hide what lay beneath. But I brought something back with me. I can feel it growing in my mind like a tumor, whispering with voices I know and love. It shows me things, visions of other installations around the world, other containment sites that are weakening as the entity's influence spreads. It tells me about the network of underground facilities, all connected by tunnels that exist in spaces between spaces, all serving the same ancient purpose. The thing inside my head is patient. It knows that eventually the conditioning will take hold completely, and I'll return to complete what I started. It's happened before. Every few years, someone finds their way to the installation, drawn by rumors or research or simple curiosity. Some flee, as I did, but they always come back. The programming ensures it. I've tried to destroy the footage, but I can't. Every time I reach for the delete button, my hand stops, controlled by something that isn't me. The entity needs the video to exist, needs it to be seen. It's how it spreads, how it finds new subjects for its collection. So I'm posting it now, while I still have enough of my own will left to include this warning. Don't look for the coordinates. Don't try to find the place I found. The installation isn't on any map for a reason. It exists in the spaces between spaces. accessible only to those who've been prepared by exposure to its influence. The symbols in my footage aren't just documentation, they're active programming designed to prepare viewers for eventual integration. If you've watched this far, you're already being conditioned. The whispers will start soon. Gentle at first, speaking with voices you trust and love. Some things are sealed for good reason, and some doors should never be opened. The entity in the sphere isn't evil in any human sense. It's simply alien, operating by rules we can't comprehend. To it, consciousness is a disease that needs curing. Individual identity, a prison that needs breaking. The countdown that began decades ago is almost over. Around the world, other installations are weakening, their containment protocols failing as the entity's influence spreads through digital networks and human minds. Each person who watches, each mind that becomes conditioned, brings it closer to its goal. I can hear them calling now. My mother, my friends, everyone I've ever loved, all speaking with one voice, urging me to return to the facility and complete my integration. The compulsion is almost irresistible, a hunger that gnaws at me every waking moment. The car keys are already in my hand, though I don't remember picking them up. The drive to Coldfoot is 3 hours, but I won't be stopping there. I know where I need to go, and part of me, the part that's no longer entirely human, is eager to arrive. If anyone finds this post after I'm gone, know that we tried to warn you. The installation isn't abandoned. It was never abandoned. It's been waiting, growing stronger, preparing for the day when the barriers between worlds grow thin enough for it to emerge. The countdown is almost over. The sphere pulses in the darkness below, ready to birth something that will remake the world in its image. And somewhere in the Arctic waste, a steel door stands slightly ajar, waiting for the next curious explorer to squeeze through and add their voice to the chorus of the damned. Don't come looking for us. We're not lost. We're found.